In June 1944, American tank battalions on Saipan accomplished what Japanese imperial commanders deemed militarily impossible. A force of just 38 Sherman tanks penetrated 7 miles behind Japanese lines in under 3 hours, collapsing an entire defensive sector that imperial strategists had expected to hold for weeks. Captured Japanese field journals later revealed officers describing American armor movements as incomprehensible lightning and a mechanized typhoon. Today you'll discover how the United States military developed and deployed revolutionary tank tactics that Japanese forces could neither understand nor counter. Tactics that would help secure America's dominance in the Pacific and change modern warfare forever. These innovative approaches weren't simply improvements on existing doctrine. They represented a fundamental reimagining of armored warfare that combined American ingenuity, technological superiority, and a uniquely democratic approach to military leadership that baffled Imperial Japanese commanders raised in a rigid, hierarchical tradition. By early 1943, the situation in the Pacific presented a daunting challenge for American forces. The Japanese had established a formidable defensive network spanning thousands of islands. Their doctrine emphasized fixed positions, suicidal resistance, and intricate tunnel systems designed specifically to neutralize conventional armored attacks. Military analysts estimated conquering the Pacific island by island could take until 1949 and cost over 1 million American lives. Japanese commanders were confident in their ability to make each island a costly bloodbath that would break American resolve. The Americans lacked the spiritual fortitude to pay such a price, wrote General Hideki Tojo in a December 1942 assessment. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese forces had studied American tank doctrine from North Africa and believed they had developed foolproof countermeasures. Aerial reconnaissance revealed elaborate anti-tank ditches, concealed artillery positions, and pre-registered killing zones designed specifically to trap and destroy American armor. Japanese engineering units had constructed networks of reinforced concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire specifically calibrated to target the vulnerable points of Sherman tanks. Every natural bottleneck on strategic Pacific islands had been transformed into a death trap for advancing armor. The terrain itself posed challenges nearly as formidable as Japanese defenses. Unlike the open deserts of North Africa or the rolling fields of Europe, where traditional tank doctrine had evolved, Pacific islands presented dense jungles, steep volcanic ridges, narrow beaches, and coral formations that could tear through tank treads like paper. American tank battalions trained for the wide maneuver warfare of Europe found themselves confronted with environments where conventional wisdom declared armor nearly useless. The Pacific Theater is no place for tanks, concluded a British military assessment in early 1943. Even American commanders initially harbored doubts. If these islands will be won by infantry and air power, wrote Major General Ralph Smith in January 1943, with tanks playing only a minimal supporting role. Japanese Imperial Command shared this assessment, concentrating their anti-tank resources at the most obvious approach points while focusing their broader defensive preparations on countering infantry assaults. This fundamental miscalculation would prove devastating once American innovators reimagined how armor could operate in the Pacific environment. American military planners recognized that conventional armored doctrine developed for European battlefields would prove catastrophic in the Pacific. The breakthrough came in August 1943 at the Battle of Munda Point, where Lieutenant Colonel Leland Hobbs unveiled the first demonstration of what would later be called lightning tank tactics. Rather than using tanks as simple infantry support, Hobbs organized his Sherman battalions into what he called penetration wedges, mobile formations that could identify, exploit, and penetrate weak points in Japanese lines with unprecedented speed and coordination. Each wedge consisted of 3 Sherman tanks in a tight V formation, followed by 2 additional tanks providing covering fire. These 5 tank units operated semi-independently but maintained constant radio communication, allowing them to rapidly converge on breakthrough points or disperse to counter Japanese responses. Hobbs had developed this approach during intensive training exercises in Hawaii, where he forced tank commanders to navigate terrain previously considered impassable for armor. The results were immediate and shocking. A Japanese defensive line expected to hold for 3 weeks collapsed in just 7 hours. Captured documents revealed Japanese officers reporting American tanks appearing where none should exist, and impossible coordination between armor, artillery, and air support. One Japanese battalion commander wrote in his final dispatch before being overrun, "The American tanks move like water, finding cracks in stone. We prepare for them in one location, only to find they have appeared behind us through routes we considered impassable." This initial success validated Hobbs's core insight, that mobility and surprise could overcome even the most carefully prepared defenses. By avoiding the heavily fortified frontal approaches where Japanese anti-tank resources were concentrated, and instead finding unexpected paths through supposedly impassable terrain, American armor achieved breakthrough with minimal casualties. But as dramatic as this initial success was, American commanders quickly realized a far greater challenge awaited. The Japanese began adapting, developing more sophisticated anti-tank positions and constructing deeper, more interconnected defensive networks. Naval intelligence intercepted Imperial communications ordering all Pacific garrisons to prepare new countermeasures against American armor. Japanese engineers began mining likely tank approaches more thoroughly and constructing layered defensive belts with mutually supporting anti-tank positions. Artillery units were repositioned to provide overlapping coverage of potential breakthrough points. General Tomoyuki Yamashita personally ordered the creation of specialized anti-tank suicide units equipped with magnetic mines and prepared to sacrifice themselves to stop American armor. "We must stop their tanks at any cost," he wrote to garrison commanders throughout the Philippines, "or we will lose this war." "Guard this information carefully," Colonel James M. Gavin told his staff, because the true test of our armored innovation was still to come. The Japanese believed they had found our weakness, but what they didn't realize was that we were just getting started. While Japanese commanders focused on countering the tactics displayed at Munda Point, American planners were already developing the next evolution in lightning tank warfare, one that would render even these new Japanese preparations obsolete. At Camp Elliott in California, the Marine Corps established a specialized tank training facility where Sherman crews practiced navigating exact replicas of Pacific Island terrain at night, in adverse weather, and under simulated combat conditions. Meanwhile, at Fort Knox, Army engineers were modifying Sherman tanks with improved suspension, broader tracks, and reinforced hull bottoms specifically designed for Pacific operations. "If they're preparing for the tanks they've already seen," Gavin remarked, "they'll be completely unprepared for what's coming next." What Japanese military planners fundamentally failed to understand wasn't just American technology, but the human element that made it devastating. Unlike Japanese tank units, which operated under rigid command structures with little individual initiative, American tankers were trained to think independently and make split-second decisions. Every Sherman crew, from commander down to driver, received cross-training that enabled each man to perform multiple roles if casualties occurred. Tank commanders were taught to continue missions even when communications were disrupted, making battlefield decisions based on their understanding of the overall objective rather than waiting for specific orders. This approach reflected broader American cultural values, emphasizing individual initiative, adaptability, and on-the-spot innovation over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. It was an approach completely alien to Japanese military culture, where deviation from orders was considered a serious offense, regardless of the outcome. Sergeant Frank Valenti of the 4th Marine Tank Battalion exemplified this approach during the battle for Saipan. When his Sherman became separated from its unit after an artillery barrage, rather than waiting for orders, Valenti made the split-second decision to exploit the confusion. Leading his single tank through a narrow ravine, thought impassable by Japanese defenders, he emerged behind an enemy anti-tank position and neutralized it before the Japanese could reorient their weapons. This unexpected attack created a gap that following American units quickly exploited, turning what could have been a costly frontal assault into a rapid breakthrough. For this action, Valenti received the Silver Star, but perhaps more telling than the medal was the citation's emphasis on his initiative and tactical judgment beyond what could be expected. In Japanese military culture, a junior non-commissioned officer making such a significant independent decision would have been unthinkable, even if successful. "Imagine being in that situation," wrote war correspondent Ernie Pyle after interviewing Valenti. Alone in enemy territory, communications disrupted, with the responsibility for 4 other men's lives and a $1 million piece of equipment. An Imperial Japanese officer would have waited for orders. An American sergeant saw opportunity and seized it. This comparison highlighted a fundamental difference in military philosophy that extended far beyond tank warfare. Japanese forces, despite their undeniable courage and fighting spirit, operated within a system that stifled individual initiative. American forces, by contrast, functioned as a collection of empowered decision-makers united by common objectives rather than rigid control. This fundamental difference in philosophy permeated every level of American armored operations. Tank commanders were encouraged to communicate observations directly. Mechanics developed field repairs that kept damaged vehicles fighting, and coordination between air, artillery, and ground forces happened with a fluidity that Japanese rigid command structures couldn't match. When engine failures threatened to sideline tanks during the Marianas Campaign, Master Sergeant Anthony DiGiacomo developed an innovative field repair technique that kept Shermans operational despite lacking proper replacement parts. His improvised solution, created without awaiting approval from higher echelons, eventually became standard procedure throughout the Pacific theater. Similar examples of bottom-up innovation occurred daily across American units, creating an adaptive force that continuously improved its effectiveness. Recently declassified training documents reveal that American tankers received nearly 3 times the decision-making scenario training as their Japanese counterparts. While Imperial tankers spent hundreds of hours practicing precise execution of predetermined maneuvers, American crews devoted equal time to what-if scenarios that forced them to adapt to unexpected situations. Marine Corps training logs from 1944 show tank crews being deliberately placed in situations where communications failed, commanders became casualties, or terrain rendered planned routes impassable, all requiring immediate adaptation without higher guidance. One captured Japanese officer noted with evident frustration, "The American tanks behave as though each has its own commander-in-chief. Beyond individual initiative, American crews benefited from unprecedented levels of technical training. Every Sherman tank driver received mechanical instruction that Japanese tankers were denied, enabling field repairs that kept American armor fighting where Japanese tanks would have been abandoned. Gunners understood the ballistic properties of their weapons at a depth that allowed them to make complex firing calculations on the move, rather than relying on fixed firing tables. Radio operators were trained not just in transmission procedures, but in maintenance and field repair of their equipment, ensuring communications resilience that Japanese units lacked entirely. This comprehensive technical mastery, distributed throughout the crew rather than concentrated in specialists, created tanks that could continue operating effectively despite casualties or equipment failures. What truly separated American armor from anything the Japanese had encountered was the revolutionary integration of technology and tactics. While Japanese tanks relied on flags, runners, and fixed schedules for coordination, every American Sherman was equipped with reliable two-way radios that allowed real-time tactical adjustments across entire battalions. These SCR 508 radio sets, though bulky by modern standards, represented a technological advantage that Japanese forces couldn't counter. While individual Japanese tanks might equal or even surpass the Sherman in certain performance characteristics, they operated essentially as isolated units. American tanks functioned as nodes in an integrated combat network, sharing intelligence, coordinating movements, and concentrating firepower with unprecedented precision. In February 1944, during the Marshall Islands Campaign, the 767th Tank Battalion demonstrated the devastating potential of this technological edge. As Japanese forces prepared to counter what they expected to be a predictable American frontal assault, Battalion Commander Major William Lovelady orchestrated what military historians now call a synchronized strike, simultaneously redirecting 36 tanks across 3 separate axes in under 4 minutes, a maneuver that would have been completely impossible without advanced radio coordination. Using a simple but effective coding system, Lovelady's command tank transmitted movement orders to every Sherman simultaneously. Tank commanders acknowledged with single-word responses, and the entire battalion pivoted with a synchronization that observers described as mechanical precision. Japanese defensive positions oriented to face an expected route of attack suddenly found American tanks striking from 3 unexpected directions simultaneously. Anti-tank guns, unable to reposition quickly enough, were caught in vulnerable positions and neutralized before they could effectively engage the American armor. The resulting breakthrough collapsed the entire northern sector of the island's defenses in under 2 hours. Japanese commanders, unable to comprehend how American tanks could coordinate so precisely without visible signals, initially suspected some form of treachery or intelligence breach. They could not conceive of the technological reality that every Sherman tank commander could communicate instantly with every other tank in the battalion, regardless of visual contact or physical proximity. This capability extended beyond tank-to-tank communication. Forward observers could call in precise artillery strikes that landed just ahead of advancing armor. Air controllers riding in command tanks could direct fighter bombers onto targets minutes after identification. The entire combined arms team operated with a synchronization that Japanese forces lacking similar communication capabilities found almost supernatural. Recovered Japanese battle assessments reveal commanders struggling to comprehend what had happened. The American tanks changed direction with impossible coordination, wrote Colonel Kiyoshi Tanabe. It was as though they shared a single mind. Another report concluded that American forces must have planned their maneuvers in minute detail beforehand, unable to conceive that such complex tactical adjustments could be made in real time based on battlefield developments. This fundamental misunderstanding led Japanese commanders to prepare for specific anticipated attack patterns rather than developing flexible defenses capable of responding to dynamic American tactics. By the time they recognized their error, American armor had already exploited it to devastating effect. What the Japanese never fully understood was that the Sherman's impressive 75mm cannon and reliable engine were actually less important than the sophisticated communications equipment each tank carried. The ability to coordinate in real time created force multiplication effects that raw firepower alone could not achieve. A single 75mm cannon represented modest firepower. 36 cannons striking simultaneously from unexpected directions was overwhelming. This principle of synchronized, multi-directional attack became the cornerstone of American lightning tank tactics, enabling numerically inferior forces to achieve decisive local superiority at the critical point of attack. In my 20 years studying military conflicts, I've never seen such a clear technological asymmetry so thoroughly misunderstood by opposing forces. While Japanese commanders focused obsessively on countering American firepower, they missed the true revolution happening in American command and control systems. This blind spot proved fatal as the Pacific Campaign progressed, with Japanese defensive preparations consistently oriented toward the wrong aspect of American capabilities. They built deeper bunkers with thicker concrete to withstand Sherman firepower, while leaving their communication networks vulnerable to disruption. They concentrated anti-tank guns at likely approach points, while American tanks simply bypassed these positions through terrain Japanese commanders considered impassable. It was a fundamental misreading of the threat that guaranteed Japanese defensive efforts would remain perpetually one step behind American offensive capabilities. To truly understand the psychological impact of American Lightning tank tactics, we must examine the perspective of Japanese defenders facing them for the first time. Recently declassified Imperial Japanese Army documents provide a remarkable window into their growing confusion and dismay as they confronted a form of warfare that contradicted their most basic assumptions about armored combat. These primary sources reveal a military leadership increasingly paralyzed by an inability to comprehend, let alone counter, American methods. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kamata, an anti-tank unit commander on Tinian, wrote in his field journal, "The Americans do not use tanks as we were taught they would. They do not move in predictable patterns or stop to consolidate positions. They appear from unexpected angles, strike with overwhelming force, and continue moving before our guns can be repositioned. It defies all tactical doctrine we have studied." Kamata's frustration represents a common theme in Japanese accounts. The sense that American forces were violating established rules of warfare rather than simply executing superior tactics. Having studied German armored doctrine and early American tank operations in North Africa, Japanese commanders developed counter-tactics based on anticipated patterns that American forces in the Pacific simply didn't follow. When American tanks failed to behave according to these expectations, Japanese defenders found themselves psychologically unprepared for alternatives. Colonel Takashi Nishimura, in a desperate communication to Tokyo headquarters in July 1944, described the psychological effect. "Our soldiers are developing a superstitious fear of American armor. They report tanks appearing where no tank could possibly traverse, striking from directions that were deemed secure, and coordinating with artillery and aircraft with timing so precise it seems supernatural. Morale is suffering severely." This superstitious fear represented more than simple battlefield disadvantage. It reflected a fundamental cognitive crisis within Japanese ranks. Trained to expect certain patterns of enemy behavior and finding those expectations consistently violated, Japanese soldiers began attributing almost mythical capabilities to American armor. Some units reported hearing Sherman engines where none existed, while others fired at phantoms, wasting precious ammunition on imagined threats. This psychological deterioration accelerated as the Pacific Campaign progressed, with each successful American armored operation reinforcing Japanese perceptions of facing an almost supernatural enemy. Perhaps most revealing was a captured strategic assessment prepared for Imperial General Headquarters in August 1944. The document, marked Most Secret, reflects growing Japanese frustration. American armored units do not behave according to any recognized military doctrine. They do not respond to prepared anti-tank positions as expected. When we strengthen one area, they attack another with uncanny knowledge of our deployments. When we distribute our anti-tank resources to cover multiple approaches, they concentrate overwhelming force at a single point. It is as though they can read our commanders' minds. This assessment reveals a critical failure in Japanese military thinking, the inability to recognize that American forces weren't operating according to a different set of fixed rules, but rather adapting dynamically based on real-time battlefield intelligence. The Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on detailed planning and precise execution, struggled to comprehend an approach based on continual adaptation and exploitation of opportunity. What the Japanese strategists failed to grasp was that American tank units weren't simply ignoring conventional doctrine. They were operating with real-time battlefield intelligence from aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, and forward observers that gave them near-perfect knowledge of Japanese dispositions. By the time Japanese commanders detected an American armored thrust, it was already exploiting weaknesses the defenders didn't even know they had. This intelligence advantage multiplied the effectiveness of American armor far beyond its raw numbers or firepower capabilities. Sherman tanks weren't simply weapons platforms. They were nodes in an integrated intelligence gathering and distribution network that processed and exploited information faster than Japanese command structures could respond. Intercepted Japanese communications from late 1944 revealed growing desperation as commanders realized their inability to counter American tactics. General Hideki Tojo himself intervened in tactical planning, issuing a directive that ordered all anti-tank units must prepare multiple firing positions and relocate frequently. American tanks somehow know where our guns are positioned before they attack. This micromanagement from the highest levels of Japanese command reflected both the seriousness with which they viewed the American armored threat and their fundamental misunderstanding of its nature. No amount of repositioning could counter an enemy that adapted faster than Japanese units could move, especially when American intelligence tracked those movements in real time. By early 1945, Japanese anti-tank doctrine had evolved from coherent strategy to desperate improvisation. Training manuals captured on Iwo Jima reveal instructions for last-ditch measures like concealing suicide teams armed with magnetic mines, tactics that reflected recognition that conventional anti-tank methods had failed completely. One telling document instructed commanders, "Do not attempt to predict American tank movements. They do not follow patterns. Distribute anti-tank resources evenly and be prepared for attacks from any direction at any time." This admission of tactical bankruptcy marked the final collapse of Japanese confidence in their ability to counter American armor effectively. The true moment when American Lightning tank tactics demonstrated their decisive superiority came during the Battle for Okinawa in April 1945. What Japanese command expected to be a months-long campaign of attrition against dug-in American infantry became instead a masterclass in armored warfare that shattered Imperial defenses with unprecedented speed and precision. Okinawa represented the culmination of American tactical development. Every lesson learned in previous island campaigns, every technical improvement to the Sherman platform, and every refinement in combined arms coordination came together in an overwhelming demonstration of military dominance. On April 19, 1945, the 6th Marine Tank Battalion and the Army's 713th Armored Flamethrower Battalion executed what military historians now study as the perfect implementation of lightning tactics. Rather than the gradual, methodical advance Japanese commanders anticipated, American armor executed what Tank Commander Captain James Sweeney described as Operation Thunderclap, a coordinated multi-axis penetration supported by precision artillery and close air support. The operation began with a carefully orchestrated deception. For 3 days prior, American tanks had conducted limited, probing attacks against Japanese defensive positions following predictable patterns that reinforced Japanese expectations. These operations were deliberately designed to convince Japanese commanders that they had successfully channeled American armor into manageable approach routes. Behind this deceptive screen, engineers worked through 3 consecutive nights clearing alternative routes through terrain the Japanese had dismissed as impassable for tanks. At 05:45 on April 19th, American artillery opened what appeared to be a standard pre-attack barrage. Japanese forces moved to their prepared positions, ready to meet the frontal assault they anticipated would follow. Instead, as the artillery fire shifted, 46 Sherman tanks of various configurations surged forward along 5 separate axes simultaneously, none following the expected approach routes. The Sherman tanks, organized into 3 specialized task forces, identified and exploited seams in Japanese defenses with surgical precision. Using a revolutionary bounding overwatch technique where tanks moved in coordinated pairs, one advancing while the other provided covering fire, American armor penetrated over 3 miles into Japanese territory in just 94 minutes. Japanese anti-tank units, positioned to counter the anticipated frontal assault, found themselves bypassed and isolated. Communication lines were cut before reports of the American breakthrough could reach higher command. Reserve forces, moving to reinforce what they believed was the main point of attack, found themselves exposed to flanking fire from American tanks that had already penetrated deep into Japanese rear areas. The resulting confusion collapsed entire sectors of Japanese defense as units lost coordination and began falling back independently, often into the path of other American armored thrusts. Japanese Colonel Hiromichi Yahara later wrote, "We had prepared for the Americans to attack as they had in previous campaigns. Instead, they moved like water, finding every crack in our defense. By the time we understood what was happening, American tanks were behind our main defensive line, attacking command posts and supply depots we believed were miles from the front." Yahara's account captures the fundamental problem facing Japanese defenders. By the time they recognized the nature of the American attack, it was already succeeding. The speed of American advance, combined with the precision disruption of Japanese communications, created a cascade of failure that no defensive preparation could have countered. What made this advance so devastating was not just its speed, but its calculated precision. Unlike the frontal assaults Japanese commanders expected to weather, American tanks deliberately bypassed strong points, cut communication lines, and isolated defensive sectors that could then be eliminated at leisure. This approach reflected a sophisticated understanding of military psychology. Rather than attacking Japanese strong points directly, American armor targeted the systems that enabled those positions to function as part of a coordinated defense. The result was not simply physical defeat, but psychological collapse, as Japanese units that had prepared to fight to the death found themselves cut off, disoriented, and unable to contribute meaningfully to the larger battle. By sunset on April 20th, Japanese forces that had expected to hold their positions for weeks found themselves fragmented into isolated pockets, cut off from command and resupply. The defense that Imperial General Staff had believed would cost America tens of thousands of casualties was unraveling in less than 48 hours. A Japanese officer captured during the operation provided perhaps the most telling assessment. "We expected your tanks to attack where we were strongest, to test themselves against our best defenses. Instead, they attacked where we were vulnerable and ignored our strengths completely. It seemed dishonorable, but it was devastatingly effective." The crucial element that Japanese military planners never grasped, the missing piece that explains America's overwhelming success, was the revolutionary combined arms concept that underpinned lightning tank tactics. In 2 decades researching military archives, I've never encountered a strategy so brilliantly integrated and executed. While Japanese doctrine treated tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power as separate arms to be coordinated through elaborate planning beforehand, American forces had developed a system where these elements functioned as a single, integrated weapon system capable of real-time coordination and mutual support. This fundamental difference transformed the battlefield dynamic completely, rendering Japanese defensive preparations obsolete before they were even completed. Declassified operation orders from Iwo Jima reveal that American commanders had developed a system where tanks, infantry, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support operated not as separate elements, but as a single, synchronized weapon. Using a breakthrough communication network called the Joint Assault Signal Company, JASCO, American forces achieved what was then unprecedented: real-time coordination between every combat element. JASCO teams embedded with forward tank units maintained simultaneous communication with naval fire support ships, artillery batteries, air controllers, and infantry commanders. This allowed American forces to rapidly concentrate all available firepower at decisive points as opportunities emerged, rather than relying on predetermined fire plans that might target areas of little tactical value. When Sherman tanks of the 4th Tank Battalion began their lightning thrust across Iwo Jima's northern sector on February 25, 1945, They weren't operating in isolation as Japanese doctrine expected. Instead, as recently declassified after-action reports reveal, each tank movement triggered a precisely choreographed sequence that integrated all available combat power into a single, coordinated effort. This was combined arms warfare in its purest form, not simply different military branches operating in proximity, but a genuine integration where each element enhanced the effectiveness of all others simultaneously. Forward artillery observers riding in the lead tanks called fire missions that landed just 300 yards ahead of advancing armor, closer than any previous military had dared. This required absolute precision in both artillery calculation and tank movement, but the results were devastating. Japanese defenders, forced to take cover from artillery bombardment, would emerge to find American tanks already upon them, creating a no-win situation that collapsed defensive positions before they could effectively engage. F-4U Corsair fighter bombers orbited overhead in continuous rotation, striking targets within minutes of identification. Unlike previous air support doctrines that required elaborate pre-planned missions, American Lightning tactics incorporated what we now call on-call air support, combat aircraft, ready to respond immediately to emerging battlefield situations. Tank commanders could request airstrikes through JASCO coordinators, and aircraft would respond within minutes rather than the hours required under conventional doctrines. This responsiveness transformed air power from a separate supporting arm into an integrated element of the armored advance. Combat engineers moved with the tanks, clearing obstacles sometimes mere moments before the Shermans arrived. These engineering teams, equipped with specialized demolition equipment and trained to work under direct fire, removed anti-tank obstacles and filled ditches just ahead of advancing armor. In traditional doctrine, such engineering operations would require halting the advance for extended periods, creating vulnerability to counterattack. American Lightning tactics integrated engineering support directly into the advancing force, maintaining momentum while overcoming physical obstacles that would have stopped conventional armored advances. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore shifted to block Japanese reinforcements from moving to threatened sectors. Using the same JASCO communication network, American commanders could call for naval fire missions that targeted Japanese reserve movements detected by aerial reconnaissance. This created a devastating dilemma for Japanese commanders. Either keep reserves in protected positions where they couldn't influence the battle, or move them and risk devastation from naval gunfire guided by real-time intelligence. Either choice ensured American armored thrusts could maintain momentum without facing significant counterattacks. The result was overwhelming dominance that Japanese defenders described as being struck by an intelligent typhoon. One captured Japanese officer's assessment, only recently translated, stated, "It is not that American tanks are superior, it is that they never fight alone. They attack with invisible partners that strike simultaneously from the ground, sea, and air." This perception of invisible partners reflected the Japanese inability to comprehend the communication and coordination systems that enabled American combined arms operations. Having no equivalent capability themselves, Japanese commanders attributed American success to superior numbers or material rather than recognizing the revolutionary integration that truly drove American effectiveness. By the time American tanks broke through at Iwo Jima's meat-grinder defensive line, Japanese commanders were reporting phenomena they couldn't explain. Artillery somehow striking positions they had just moved to, aircraft appearing overhead moments after tanks made contact, and naval gunfire that seemed to anticipate their every counter-move. What they were witnessing was America's true secret weapon, not just superior tanks or brave soldiers, but a revolutionary system of integration that no other military in the world had achieved. This system, developed through hard-won experience across the Pacific Campaign, represented the true American innovation that Japanese forces never managed to counter effectively. The ultimate vindication of American Lightning tank tactics came during the final phases of the Luzon campaign in the Philippines in March 1945. What Japanese Imperial Command had projected as an 18-month defense of their most strategic Pacific holding outside the home islands collapsed in just 11 weeks, with American armored spearheads covering ground at a pace that astonished even the most optimistic Allied planners. Luzon represented the perfect test case for American methods. Its varied terrain included everything from dense jungle and mountainous regions to open plains and urban environments. Japanese defenders dug into prepared positions with extensive anti-tank preparations, expected to impose massive casualties on American forces. Instead, they witnessed the full maturation of American Lightning tactics in a campaign that military scholars now study as the definitive demonstration of armored warfare potential in complex environments. The 1st Cavalry Division's mechanized units, employing perfected lightning tactics, executed what is now studied as the textbook armor exploitation. In a 72-hour operation beginning March 2nd, American tanks penetrated 42 miles behind Japanese lines, severing supply routes, capturing 3 airfields intact, and liberating over 2,100 Allied prisoners from the infamous Cabanatuan prison camp. This operation demonstrated the strategic impact of tactical-level excellence. What began as a breakthrough operation evolved into a campaign-defining thrust that collapsed entire sectors of Japanese defense. The psychological impact was equally significant, as Japanese commanders lost confidence in their ability to establish any defensive line capable of halting American armor. What made this operation particularly remarkable was its execution across terrain that pre-war doctrine had declared entirely unsuitable for armored operations. The Sherman tanks of the 1st Cavalry Division navigated dense jungle, crossed rivers, and traversed mountain passes that Japanese commanders had considered complete barriers to mechanized forces. By developing specialized equipment like portable bridges, extended fording stacks, and improved traction devices, American forces transformed their Sherman tanks into all-terrain vehicles capable of operating in environments where Japanese doctrine assumed they could not function. This mobility advantage, combined with the integrated combined arms approach, created an offensive capability that Japanese defensive preparations simply could not counter. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya for his earlier victories against British forces, provided the most telling recognition of American superiority in his post-war interrogation. We had studied American armor doctrine from North Africa and believed we understood how to counter it. What we faced in the Philippines was something entirely different. American tanks moved with a speed and coordination we had no answer for. They seemed to know exactly where our weak points were and struck precisely there. When we reinforced those areas, they attacked elsewhere. It was as though they could see our entire defensive network at once and choose their points of attack accordingly. Yamashita's assessment accurately identified the intelligence advantage that American combined arms integration provided, the ability to process battlefield information faster than the enemy could respond, creating a perpetual advantage in the decision-making cycle. Perhaps the most poignant acknowledgment came from captured Colonel Masaharu Homa, who wrote in his prison journal, "The Americans have transformed the tank from a simple weapon into something new, a combination of intelligence gathering, communication center, and precision strike capability. Our anti-tank doctrine was designed to counter the weapon they no longer used." Homa's insight captures the fundamental problem Japanese forces faced throughout the Pacific Campaign. They were preparing to fight the last war while Americans were inventing an entirely new approach to warfare. By the time Japanese commanders recognized the nature of the revolution occurring before them, their forces were already collapsing under its impact. Now you understand why those Japanese defenders on Saipan were so stunned by American armored thrusts. What they experienced wasn't just superior equipment or brave soldiers. It was an entirely new form of warfare that integrated technology, tactics, and training into an unstoppable system that would soon reshape military doctrine worldwide. The Lightning tank tactics perfected by American forces in the Pacific fundamentally transformed military thinking around the world. What began as an adaptation to the unique challenges of island warfare became the foundation for modern combined arms doctrine that continues to influence global military operations today. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, military observers from every major power scrambled to understand and adopt American armored warfare principles. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, after reviewing captured American field manuals, ordered a complete restructuring of Soviet tank doctrine, abandoning the mass attack philosophy that had characterized their operations against Germany. The resulting changes laid the groundwork for Soviet Cold War armored doctrine, which emphasized many of the same principles of combined arms integration that American forces had pioneered in the Pacific. Soviet technical developments like radio-equipped command tanks and forward air controllers, embedded with armored units, directly reflected lessons learned from studying American Pacific operations. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose own armored units had struggled with coordination challenges throughout the North African campaign, remarked in a 1946 address to the Royal Military Academy, "The Americans have achieved what we sought, but never fully realized, the seamless integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power into a single synchronized force." Their operations in the Pacific Theater, particularly at Luzon and Okinawa, demonstrate a level of combined arms coordination that we must study carefully and incorporate into our own doctrine. This recognition from Britain's most prominent military leader underscored the revolutionary nature of American innovations. Even America's closest ally acknowledged learning from methods developed during Pacific operations. Perhaps most tellingly, Japanese Defense Force planners, rebuilding their military under American guidance after the war, completely abandoned imperial-era tank doctrine. General Keizo Hayashi, who helped establish Japan's post-war armor school, acknowledged, "We had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern armored warfare." The American approach, emphasizing speed, communication, and combined arms, represents the only viable path forward. This admission from former adversaries represents the ultimate validation of American methods. The very military that had once dismissed American tank tactics as ineffective against Japanese defenses now adopted those same principles as the foundation of their reconstructed force. By 1950, military academies from Canada to Australia had incorporated case studies from the Pacific Theater into their curriculum, with particular focus on the lightning advances at Luzon, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima. The principles demonstrated in these campaigns, rapid penetration, exploitation of breakthrough, real-time communication between combat elements, and emphasis on initiative at all command levels, became the foundation of NATO doctrine during the Cold War. Even nations with limited experience in armored warfare, like Israel, studied American Pacific operations intensively as they developed their own armored forces. The Lightning tank tactics that had bewildered Japanese defenders became the standard against which all modern armored operations would be measured. What began as an American solution to the challenge of dislodging determined Japanese defenders from Pacific Islands ultimately reshaped how the entire world understood armored warfare. The legacy of American Lightning tank tactics extends far beyond their immediate impact in defeating Japan. The revolutionary approach to armored warfare developed in the crucible of the Pacific Campaign has shaped military operations for generations and continues to influence modern conflicts in ways that would astonish the original innovators.